Chapter 4. What lies behind the law? Let us sum up what we have reached so far. In the case of stones and trees and things of that sort, what we call the laws of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. When you say that nature is governed by certain laws, this may only mean that nature does, in fact, behave in a certain way. The so-called laws may not be anything real, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. But in the case of man, we saw that this will not do. The law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent, which we know we ought to obey. I now want to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they've been wondering what this universe really is, and how it came to be there. And very roughly, two views have been held. First, there's what is called the materialistic view. People take that view, think that matter and space just happen to exist, and always have existed. Nobody knows why, and that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways is just happen by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets, and by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets, and so some of the matter on this earth came alive. And then, by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes, prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself, to the extent of having minds. Please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and that the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And note this too, you cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such as part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so-and-so. Or I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature and I did so-and-so. Do not think I'm saying anything against science. I'm only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more, I believe, he would agree with me that this is the job of science. And a very useful and necessary job it is too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there's anything behind the things science observes, is something of a different kind. This is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing, and the statement that there is no such thing, are neither of them statements that science can make. And real scientists do not usually make them. It is usually the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks who go in for them. After all, it is really a matter of common sense. Supposing science ever became complete, so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as they were. Now the position would be quite hopeless, but for this. There is one thing, and only one, in the whole universe, which we know more about than we can learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make, and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations will only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there were anything above or behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, can never hope to discover it. The position of the question, then, is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is an answer behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would be not one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. There is only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case, and in that one case, we find there is. Or put it the other way around. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or a staircase or a fireplace in that house. But the only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves, as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we do find inside ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicions. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, the answer turns out to be yes. In the other cases, where you do not get an answer, you see why you do not. Suppose someone asked me, when I see a man in blue uniform going down the street leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose that they contain letters. I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if then objected, but you never seen all these letters, which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not, and I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. It's the same about this question. The only packet I'm allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I don't exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. I don't, of course, think that if I could get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing. Just as I don't think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. I should expect, for instance, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, that whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature, he compels the stone to obey the law of its stony nature. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. Do not think I'm going faster than I really am. I'm not within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology. All I've got to do is all I have is a something which is directing the universe, and which appears in me as a law, urging me to do right, and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know, because after all, the only other thing we know is in matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. But of course it needs not be very like a mind, still less like a person. In the next chapter we shall see if we can find out anything more about it. But one word of warning. There has been a great deal of soft soap talked about God for the last 100 years. That is not what I am offering. You can cut all that out. Chapter 5. We have cause to be uneasy. I ended my last chapter with the idea that in the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe was actually getting at us. And I expect when I reached that point, some of you felt a certain annoyance. You may even have thought that I had played a trick on you, that I had been carefully wrapping it up to look like philosophy, where it turns out to be one more religious jaw. You may have felt that you were ready to listen to me as long as you thought I had anything new to say. But if it turns out to be only religion, well, the world has tried that, and you cannot put the clock back. If anyone is feeling that way, I should like to say 3 things to him. First, as to putting the clock back, Would you think I was joking if I said that you can put a clock back and that if the clock is wrong, it is often a very sensible thing to do? But I'd rather get away from that whole idea of clocks. We all want progress. But progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. We all have seen this when doing arithmetic. When I've started to sum the wrong way, the sooner I admit this and go back and start again, the faster I shall get on. There's nothing progressive about being pig-headed and refusing to admit a mistake. And I think if you look at the present state of the world, it is pretty plain that humanity has been making some big mistake. We are on the wrong road, and if that is so, we must go back. Going back is the quickest way on. Then secondly, this is not yet turned exactly into a religious jaw. We have not yet got as far as the God of any actual religion, still less the God of the particular religion called Christianity. We have only got as far as a somebody or something behind the moral law. We are not taking anything from the Bible or the churches. We are trying to see what we can find out about this somebody on our own steam. And I want to make it quite clear that what we find out on our own steam is something that gives us a shock. We have two bits of evidence about this somebody. One is the universe he has made. If we use that as our only clue, then I think we should have to conclude that he was a great artist. For the universe is a very beautiful place, but also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man. For the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is the moral law which he has put into our minds. And that is a better bit of evidence than the other, because it is inside information. You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe. In general, just as you find out more about man by listening to his conversations than by looking at the house he has built. Now, from the second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, truthfulness. In that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions, that God is good. Good. But don't let us go too fast here. The moral law doesn't give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There's nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. It is no use at this stage saying that what you mean by a good God is a God who can forgive. You're going too quickly. Only a person can forgive, and we have not yet got as far as a personal God, only as far as a power behind the moral law. And more like a mind than it is like anything else, but it may still be very unlike a person. If it is pure impersonal mind, there may be no sense in asking it to make allowances for you or to let you off, just as there's no sense in asking the multiplication table to let you off when you do your sums wrong. You are bound to get the wrong answer. And it is no use either saying that if there is a God of that sort, an impersonal absolute goodness, then you don't like him and are not going to bother about him. For the trouble is that one part of you is on his side and really agrees with his disapproval of human greed and trickery and exploitation. You may want him to make an exception in your own case, to let you off this one time, but you know at the bottom that unless that power behind the world really and unalterably detests that sort of behavior, then he cannot be good. On the other hand, we know that if there does exist an absolute goodness, it must hate of what we do. This is a terrible fix we're in. If the universe is not governed by an absolute goodness, then all of our efforts are in the long run hopeless. But if it is, then we're making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day, and are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow. And so our case is hopeless again. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. God is the only comfort. He's also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He's our only possible ally. We made ourselves his enemy. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. They are still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way you react to it. And we have reacted the wrong way. Now my third point. When I chose to get to my real subject in this roundabout way, I was not trying to play any kind of trick on you. I had a different reason. My reason was that Christianity simply doesn't make sense until you have faced the sort of facts I've been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who don't know they have done anything to repent of and who don't feel the need of any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there's a real moral law and a power behind the law and put yourself wrong with that power. It is after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. When you know you are sick, you will listen to the doctor. When you have realized that our position is nearly desperate, you'll begin to understand what the Christians are talking about. They offer an explanation of how we got in our present state, of both hating goodness and loving it. They offer an explanation of how God can be this impersonal mind at the back of the moral law and yet also a person. They tell you how the demands of this law, which you and I cannot meet, have been met on our behalf. How God himself became a man to save man from the disapproval of God. It is an old story, and if you want to go into it, you will no doubt consult people of more authority to talk about it than I have. All I'm doing is to ask people to face the facts, to understand the questions which Christianity claims to answer. And they are very terrifying facts. I wish it was possible to say something more agreeable, but I must say what I think is true. Of course, I quite agree that Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort. But it doesn't begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I have been describing. And it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through that dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you cannot get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. Most of us have got over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It's time we did the same about religion. Book 2. What Christians Believe. Chapter 1. The Rival Conceptions of God. I've been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I'm going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you're a Christian, you are free to think that all those religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that matters to them most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there's only one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong. But some of the wrong answers are much nearer being right than others. The first big division of humanity into the majority who believes in some kind of god or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, lines up with ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Mohammedans, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. Now I go on to the next big division. People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. There are two very different ideas on this subject. One of them is the idea that he is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, it is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad. And the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, that the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man, but you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. It all depends on the point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God beyond good and evil, is called pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel, and as far as I can understand them, by the Hindus. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians. Muslims, he has a different word for it. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body. That the universe almost is God, so that if he did not exist, he would not exist either. And anything you find in the universe is a part of God. Christian idea is quite different. They think God invented and made the universe like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture and does not die if his picture is destroyed. You may say he's put a lot of himself into it, but you only mean that all of its beauty and interest has come out of his head. His skill is not in the picture in the same way that it is in his head or even his hands. Expect you see how this difference between pantheism and Christian hangs together with the other one. If you don't take the distinctions between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think something's really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that. You must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you realize that this also is God. Christian replies, don't talk damned nonsense. For Christianity is a fighting religion. It thinks God made the world. That space and time, heat and cold, all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of his head. As a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists very loudly on our putting them right again. And of course, it raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? For many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question because I kept on feeling whatever you say, and however clever your arguments are, it isn't much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power. Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. The whole universe has no meaning. We should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as, if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning.